What if the most powerful bomb America has ever built still wasn't the thing that actually trapped Iran? What if the real trap is something much smaller, buried in a mountain, and Iran built it with their own two hands? Quick favor before we go further. Hit subscribe right now, because by the end of this video you'll understand something most channels covering this war still get wrong. And drop one word in the comments, just one word, for what you think happens next. I read every single one of them, and I want to know where your head is at before you hear mine. Let's rewind to June 2025, because that's where this entire story actually begins. The United States and Israel launched a massive strike called Operation Midnight Hammer. Stealth bombers flew all the way from a base in Missouri, crossing the globe in near total silence, and dropped a series of 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs on two of Iran's most important nuclear sites, Fordo and Natanz. For a moment, it looked like a knockout blow. Centrifuge halls destroyed, power systems wrecked, the kind of damage that takes years to rebuild. But here's the detail that barely made headlines at the time, and it's the detail that explains everything that came after. Days before those bombs fell, satellite images showed trucks lined up outside a tunnel entrance at a nuclear site near Isfahan. Analysts who studied those images believe Iran had already moved a large portion of its most dangerous material, uranium enriched to nearly weapons-grade levels, somewhere safer before a single bomb dropped. Roughly 400 kilograms of it, maybe more. That's not a small mistake by the United States. That's Iran seeing the strike coming and quietly protecting its most valuable asset. Give credit where it's due. That was smart. What happened next is where it stopped being smart. Because Iran didn't just save that uranium. It made a decision to keep it inside the country, no matter what any peace deal said, no matter how much pressure came from Washington. And that single decision is the reason this war never actually ended. It just kept mutating into something bigger. Now here's the part that almost nobody outside the region fully absorbed, and it changes the entire shape of this story. In February of 2026, a brand new and far more devastating wave of strikes hit Iran. This wasn't a repeat of the 2025 raid. This was bigger, and it had a different target entirely. American and Israeli forces killed Iran's supreme leader, the man who had ruled the country for nearly 4 decades. Along with him, several senior military and intelligence commanders were killed in the same operation. Think about what that actually means. The man who had spent decades building Iran's nuclear ambitions, who had personally overseen its entire security doctrine, was suddenly gone. Iran didn't just lose weapons and buildings this time. It lost its head of state. Within about a week, Iran's Assembly of Experts, the clerical body responsible for choosing a new leader, named a successor, his own son. A man in his mid-50s with deep ties to the military wing of the regime, widely seen as even more hardline than his father. The United States publicly called that choice unacceptable. Israel called him a target. And just like that, Iran entered the most dangerous chapter of its modern history, with an untested leader trying to hold together a country that was already at war on multiple fronts. That's the piece the loudest voices online keep skipping past. This isn't the same Iran making the same decisions under the same leadership that existed back in 2025. This is a country in the middle of a succession crisis, fighting a war it didn't fully choose the timing of, led by a man who has never run a country before, let alone one under siege. In response to the February strikes, Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that a massive share of the world's oil physically has to pass through. The United States answered with a naval blockade. For weeks, the region sat in a state of controlled chaos, until Pakistan stepped in to mediate a ceasefire in early April. Talks in Islamabad tried to build something more permanent, but they collapsed. The blockade came back. And then in mid-June, something surprising happened. The United States and Iran actually signed a real agreement, a memorandum of understanding, with Iran's president putting his name on it, alongside the American president. The blockade lifted. Oil began moving again. For about 3 weeks, it looked like maybe, just maybe, exhaustion had won out over escalation. Then came early July. Ships were attacked. Passing through the Strait of Hormuz, Iran was blamed. Within a day, the American president declared the truce over, and strikes resumed, this time hitting a long list of military targets across Iran. By early August, the naval blockade was back in full force, and it hasn't lifted since. As of this week, the man overseeing that blockade for the American military said publicly that it can be sustained indefinitely, simply by rotating ships in and out for as long as it takes. Dozens of commercial vessels have already been redirected. Several have been disabled, a couple have been boarded outright. This isn't a symbolic gesture anymore. It's a slow, methodical strangling of Iran's ability to trade with the outside world. And through all of that back and forth, one question never went away. Where exactly is that uranium now, and what is Iran planning to do with it? Almost every serious analyst watching this conflict points to the same location, a site the world has started calling Pickaxe Mountain. Its real name is Kue Kolang Gazla, and the nickname comes directly from the translation, because Kolang means pickaxe in Persian. It sits about 1.5 miles south of the Natanz enrichment complex, the same complex that got hit back in 2025. Iran first told international inspectors about this site back in 2020 and 2021, describing it as a facility for assembling centrifuges. But construction never stopped. If anything, it sped up dramatically after the 2025 strikes destroyed Iran's other enrichment capacity. What makes this site genuinely frightening from a military planning perspective isn't just that it's underground. Plenty of nuclear sites are underground. It's what it's underground in. The main chambers are believed to sit more than 100 meters beneath solid granite rock. Granite isn't like the softer sedimentary rock that Fordo and Natanz were carved into. Granite is dense, unforgiving, and specifically the kind of geology you'd choose if your entire goal was building something immune to America's most powerful conventional weapons. The American president hasn't been shy about any of this. Standing in front of reporters, he said the United States would be hitting that area, in his words, pretty soon, and that there wasn't much Iran could do to stop it. That's not a diplomatic hint. That's about as direct as a threat gets from a sitting head of state. Iran's response has followed a familiar script: warnings on state television that any strike on the site would represent a massive escalation, along with vague promises of a devastating response. We've heard versions of that promise before, more than once, since this war started back in February. So far, the retaliation has rarely matched the size of the rhetoric. But here's the number that should actually keep people up at night. And unlike a lot of what gets thrown around online about this conflict, this one comes directly from the United Nations' own nuclear watchdog. As of last year, Iran was sitting on roughly 440 kilograms of uranium, enriched to 60% purity, dangerously close to weapons grade. The head of that watchdog agency has said publicly that a significant portion of that stockpile, somewhere around 200 kilograms, is believed to be sitting in deep tunnels near Isfahan, right in the same area as Pickaxe Mountain. Inspectors have not been allowed anywhere near it to confirm exactly where it is or what condition it's in. That's not a rumor. That's the official position of the agency, whose entire job is tracking nuclear material around the planet. And that unresolved question is exactly why this conflict refuses to end. If you're finding this useful, this is usually the point where I'd ask you to like the video. But let's do something different instead. Reply to this comment section with what year you think this war actually ends. Not this month, not this decade, the actual year. I want to see the range of answers because I have a feeling it's going to surprise both of us. Let's talk about what this war is actually doing to Iran from the inside, because the military side is only half the story. The economic side might be doing even more damage. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz back in early March, the head of the International Energy Agency described it as the largest disruption to global oil markets in history. That's not an exaggeration for effect. That waterway normally carries roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply. When it shuts down, prices don't just rise, they spike violently, and the entire global economy feels it within days. Brent crude surged past $120 a barrel in the early weeks of the closure. Inflation ticked upward across multiple continents. The World Bank slashed its global growth forecast to the lowest level since the pandemic. And here's the part that really matters for understanding Iran's position specifically. The World Bank projected that the wider Gulf economies, the ones surrounding Iran, would grow by barely more than 1% this year, compared to over 4% the year before. For Iran itself, the bank didn't even attempt to forecast. Their own words were that the uncertainty was, quote, exceptionally high. When international economists can't even model your economy anymore, that tells you something about how badly things have deteriorated. Every time the blockade goes back into effect, and it has now happened more than once, it cuts off the primary lifeline keeping Iran's economy functioning. This is a nation where the overwhelming majority of trade has to physically pass through that one strait. There's no easy workaround. You can't quietly reroute a fifth of your oil exports through a back door. The ships get identified, tracked, and in growing numbers, intercepted. Dozens have already been redirected under the current blockade, several disabled, a couple seized outright. And the American commander overseeing this operation has made it clear this isn't a temporary squeeze. It's designed to be sustainable for as long as it takes. Think about what that pressure actually does to a country in real time. Currency loses value. Prices for everyday goods climb. Fuel becomes harder to get even inside a country that sits on some of the largest oil reserves on the planet, because the export machine that funds everything else has been choked off. And all of this is happening while the country is simultaneously trying to absorb the loss of its head of state and manage a leadership transition that nobody planned for, under a brand new leader with essentially no experience running a country during a crisis this severe. That's the environment Iran's new leadership actually has to make decisions in. Not calm, not stable, not from a position of strength, from a position of trying to keep the lights on while multiple fires burn at once. So let's go back to the uranium, Because this is really where every thread in this story ties together into one single, inescapable trap. Look at the actual choices sitting in front of Iran's leadership right now. They could hand the material over as part of a genuine, verified settlement. But that would mean admitting publicly, after nearly a year of silence, exactly how much they have and exactly where it's been hidden this entire time. It would mean opening the door to inspectors who have been locked out since before the original 2025 strikes. For a government already fighting to look strong after losing its previous leader, that kind of transparency looks a lot like surrender. Or they could leave it buried under the mountain and simply bet that granite and depth are enough to keep it out of reach. That's a bet against the entire direction of American bunker buster technology that is specifically being pushed forward right now because of this exact site. Military planners have reportedly discussed pairing smaller bombs with the larger ones in sequence, one to crack the surface, a second to punch through to depth. It's the same logic as trying to break into a reinforced safe. You don't hit it once and hope, you soften it first, then you go for the real strike. Or, third option, they could try to quietly dilute the material themselves, bringing it down from that dangerous enrichment level to something closer to what a civilian reactor would use. Iran's own foreign ministry has floated that idea in past negotiations. But without inspectors present to verify it actually happened, nobody in Washington or in Vienna is going to accept Iran's word for it. Not after everything that's happened. Not after a year of unanswered questions. None of those three paths lead anywhere good for Iran. And that's not a trap the United States engineered from a war room somewhere. It's a trap built entirely out of Iran's own choices. Hide the material, refuse to disclose its location, refuse to let inspectors anywhere near it, and then watch as every single one of those decisions becomes the exact justification the rest of the world uses to keep the pressure on. Strike after strike, blockade after blockade, until either the material is found or the leadership hiding it can no longer hold on. And here's the number that explains why nobody in Washington is willing to just wait this out patiently. Before the 2025 strikes even happened, American intelligence assessments had already concluded that Iran's centrifuge capacity was advanced enough that, if it made the final decision to sprint toward an actual weapon, it could theoretically produce enough material for several bombs in a matter of weeks, not months, not years. Weeks. That short a window is exactly why nobody is comfortable letting an unverified stockpile sit quietly underground indefinitely, no matter what promises get made on state television. Before we go further, if you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding this properly instead of just watching headlines fly by. Do me a favor and share this with the one friend who keeps asking you what's actually going on over there. This is the version that actually explains it. Now let's zoom out, because the uranium isn't happening in a vacuum. It's tangled up with a much bigger regional picture. Iran's allies and proxies across the region have been trying to open up pressure points elsewhere, hoping to stretch American attention and resources thin. Shipping lanes beyond the Strait of Hormuz have faced their own threats and disruptions. Neighboring countries with a direct stake in keeping trade routes open have started responding with force of their own. Because a second closed waterway on top of Hormuz would be catastrophic for global shipping, not just regional shipping. There's also a broader question hanging over all of this involving other major powers watching from the sidelines. A prolonged conflict that keeps American military and political attention locked onto the Gulf is, strategically speaking, useful to certain global rivals who would rather that attention wasn't focused somewhere else entirely. Whether or not there's any direct coordination happening behind closed doors, the incentive structure speaks for itself. Every dollar and every unit of political focus spent managing this war is a dollar and a focus point not being spent elsewhere. Back home in the United States, this war doesn't enjoy universal support either. There's real political disagreement about how far this should go, how long it should continue, and what the endgame even looks like. That kind of division matters, because Iran's entire long-term strategy has always leaned on one basic bet, that if they simply absorb the pain and wait long enough, domestic political pressure inside the United States will eventually force a withdrawal or a soft settlement. Historically, that's not a foolish bet. Plenty of regimes have successfully worn down American patience given enough time. But here's why that clock is working against Iran in a way it hasn't in past conflicts. The uranium situation isn't a temporary controversy that fades from the headlines after a few news cycles. It's an ongoing, renewable, entirely legitimate justification for continued pressure, and it doesn't go away just because political winds shift in Washington. Every single day that material stays unverified and unaccounted for is another day the argument for continued strikes and continued blockades writes itself. Meanwhile, the economic math for Iran gets worse, not better, with every week that passes. A country watching its currency collapse, its trade routes strangled, and its new, untested leadership trying to hold a fractured government together simply doesn't have the same runway that a stable, unified regime might have had to just quietly wait this out. So, where does this actually go from here? If Pickaxe Mountain does get struck, And every signal coming out of Washington suggests that's a matter of when rather than if. The real question becomes whether that uranium is even still there by the time the bombs fall, or whether it's already been quietly moved again to some location nobody is tracking yet. Either outcome keeps this story running. If the material survives underground, Iran still has the exact same unresolved problem it has right now. An unverified stockpile that keeps giving the rest of the world a reason to maintain pressure indefinitely. If it gets destroyed or buried beyond recovery, that could actually remove the single biggest point of conflict in this entire war, though almost certainly at the cost of the kind of retaliation Iran has been promising in one form or another for months now. What we've watched unfold since February doesn't look like a conflict that's slowing down. It looks like one that keeps finding new ways to escalate, wrapped around a leadership transition nobody saw coming and an economy running out of room to absorb more damage. Iran's leadership made a bet the moment they decided to keep that uranium hidden inside the country, instead of putting it on the table as part of a real, verifiable settlement. They bet that secrecy would give them leverage. Instead, it became the single biggest reason the walls keep closing in, instead of opening up. That's the real story here. Not one massive knockout blow, but a slow, grinding trap built almost entirely out of decisions Iran made for itself, one very expensive day at a time. So, here's what I actually want to know from you. Do you think that mountain gets hit in the next few weeks, or does this drag into a longer standoff while both sides keep testing each other's limits? Do you think Iran's new leadership eventually hands that material over under enough pressure, or do you think they'd rather let everything collapse before admitting what they've been sitting on this whole time? Put your honest answer in the comments. I genuinely read them, and if this helped you actually understand what's happening instead of just watching the noise scroll by, subscribe, hit like, and share it with someone who's been trying to keep up with this story and keeps getting lost halfway through. Because once you understand the uranium piece, everything else about this war finally starts to make sense. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.